Welcome to Millennium Counseling Center's podcast, where each week we go in depth into all things mental health, addiction recovery, and being our healthiest and happiest self. Enjoy. Good morning, Derek.
How are you?
I'm doing okay. Well, the lead up today, we were talking about a universal topic of relationships and how that plays out for people and what we're seeing in our caseloads and how we're navigating that. No kind of like easy way to jump in other than we both agree that people aren't always super happy in relationships. So what are you seeing with your clients and what are some common things that you're hearing?
Yeah, I think when we were talking about this, you said something that was an interesting setup for this about kind of a plan and expectations. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that because I think it'll be helpful.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've noticed and probably other people have noticed as well is there's a lot of boxes to check from 0 to 30. And that includes make friends, get good grades, do well in sports, achieve, get into the college that you want, find a partner, get a dog, have a kid, buy real estate. And then after that, there isn't really a lot of boxes to check. And people aren't asking you, and you made a funny joke, like, how's your communication, your relationship? But people will ask you, how's your marriage? How's your job? And so I think what happens is we kind of get to these places in our lives where the boxes are checked, but we don't really know where to go from there or how to further ourselves in the things that we have and we're doing in our life.
Yeah, I think when you're talking about a relationship or with a partner, I think that, the question I always look at is, do you have a pathway in resolving something that you disagree on? Meaning that, there's going to be disagreements, whether it's in a romantic relationship, if it's a business partnership, any type of partnerships, although we're talking about kind of more on the romantic side right now. But I think that for all those relationships, we need to have a pathway to be able to talk through things and communicate when we're disagreeing on something and in a way that's going to come to some sort of resolution, not necessarily, the tangible resolution, but having, kind of both feel like they are being represented in the conversation and are able to express their opinion. And I think oftentimes what happens is that in relationships, what you have is you have two people who want maybe very different things. One person wants to buy a red car and the other person wants to buy a blue car. And many times the solution is either the red car or the blue car, so that one person is getting exactly what they want and the other person isn't getting anything close to what they want. And I think most of those times there's a third choice that ultimately means that neither of you are maybe getting exactly what you want, but neither of you are walking away feeling like you weren't represented or you weren't heard. And I think that, it's really important to be able to have kind of open pathways to be able to have those type of conversations and then both be reasonable about, what you need and what your expectations are, and really trying to come to a place that both people can walk away feeling like there was some resolution.
Yeah. Well, a couple things that you'd said that resonate with me. One is that some people come in and say, I've never fight in my relationship. And that scares the shit out of me. Like that there's two individuals that are sharing a life together and that there's no conflict. So in my mind is like, where is that going? Right? Are you escaping with that into like not being committed to a relationship, but into work, into other things, right? And the other thing is like just a lack of awareness that there is disagreements or that there is conflict or differing opinions, whatever it may be. And so for me, I really try to normalize that difference is good and trying to kind of come up with a game plan of if difference is good, then how do we want to approach that? Instead of me not addressing it, you feeling like this relationship doesn't kind of provide the container or the safety to talk about things, just to begin to say, okay, when we have differences, how do we want to approach that? right? Do we want to talk about it? Do we want to go for a walk? Do we want to write each other a letter? Like, how do we want to deal with that? Because if we don't really kind of have a plan for what to do when these things come up, then we're going to go 5, 10, 15 years without any conversations around that. And most likely, if you were to interview people that far down the road, they'd tell you all the things that were wrong, but they just didn't have a strategy or an intention about what to do with that in the relationship.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that this especially gets a little dicey when the things that you are needing to talk about or want to talk about are something that the other person could potentially take defensively, right? It's something about the person. And I think that in a healthy relationship, my belief is that each person should want to know if the other person's bothered by something. And if you ask people individually, say, if your partner is bothered by something, would you like that information? Most people will say yes. They will say, yes, that would be helpful. Where some of the breakdown occurs is when that information is actually shared and then how that is responded to and how is that taken. And, you and I were talking before this, and something that comes up a lot in the work that we do is that, for one thing, how you're approaching that conversation is important. How you go about telling your partner that there's something bothering you. And you need to do that in a way knowing that there is a high chance of the person feeling defensive about that, right? So you have to do it in a way that doesn't feel so attacking. But secondarily, if I go to my partner with something that I'm bothered by, I'm doing that because I'm hoping that the response that I will get will be something that I feel good about, that I either have more hope or I believe they heard me or any of those things. And I think that is part of the challenge, is that many times when people go to their partners, they don't walk away. They actually walk away feeling worse. And so they then kind of make a rule in their head, well, I'm not going to do that again. And ultimately that shuts down the communication, which then is just going to exacerbate the problems as we go down the line.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think I've learned through the course of my life and therapy and different relationships that I've been in is what is going on with me has absolutely nothing to do with somebody else. It had only to do with me. So if I ask my kid to put their shoes on and get ready for school and they don't, that has nothing to do with them. I'm having my own relationship with expectations or someone not listening to me or what I think they should be doing or how they should be doing it. That has nothing to do with them. So if I get angry, that is my responsibility. And I think the same thing is true in relationships. If somebody is not communicative enough, if somebody is doing things that don't feel loving or supportive, you're having your own reactions. And I think that's one of the ways when we communicate that can be really kind of disarming is here's what's happening within me. I'm not telling you that you're bad or that you're wrong, but when these things go on, these are the things that happen within me that I got to figure out. And if you care about me enough, then maybe you'll support that these things don't land very well with me. Or so, like, if I leave my dishes in the sink and that makes you really annoyed, like, I may want to spend more time putting away the dishes because I know that that will support your well-being and I'm supporting your relationship, this relationship. So that's one big differentiator that I try to talk with people about is putting this on somebody else will most likely dissolve a relationship pretty quickly. But if you can find the thing that's happening within you and talk about what's happening in you, then most likely they're going to be able to listen. And if that is a supporting and caring relationship, then they may actually care about making some changes.
Yeah, and I think what ends up coming out in a lot of these conversations, right, which you were just talking about there, is that many times when people are frustrated or bothered by something, then the focus is on the other person. They did this, they said this, they don't do this. And ultimately then what happens is we end up not focusing on the part that we actually have some control of, which is our part, right? That's the part that we have the most control of. And that's why people get frustrating, because their partner is doing something that they're frustrated with, and then they want that person to do something different. So that in itself is not a bad thing. But I think that if in any partnership, if each person is focusing on their role and what they can do to make that a better relationship, then that's ideal. I think in a really healthy relationship, right? Both people feel like they have the ability to go to their partner and tell them that something is bothering them, and that in a healthy relationship, both people want that information. They want to know if their partner's bothered by something. The kind of three things that I always recommend to people to stay away from when someone comes to you. So if your partner comes to you and says, "Hey, I want to talk to you about something, this really bothers me," then the typical reaction usually falls in one of three categories, right? It's either one, that's not true, or you're wrong, or invalidating that. The next thing we sometimes do is we flip it around and we say, "Oh yeah, but you do this," or we kind of defer to them and get the focus off, whatever they're telling you. And then the last thing is we will appease them and we will just say, "Oh, okay, yeah, I can see why it's frustrating. I won't do that again." But in our internal brain, really have no intention of doing anything differently because we don't agree with it, we don't understand it, whatever that is, but we just want to avoid the conflict. Realistically, these conversations don't need to be conflict. Difficult conversations don't need to be conflict. And I think many times we look at those that way. And because most people don't like to engage in conflict, then we end up avoiding those conversations. So much of this comes around communication, and there's a lot you can talk about within communication within a partnership. But I just think that for each person to be open to hearing things that their partner cares about, and then making a genuine effort to understand it, validate it, and show them a pathway. If my partner comes to me and says that they're bothered with something, I want to reward them for doing that because that's something I would like them to do. And I would need to reward them with having that be a good experience and not a negative experience.
Absolutely. Totally. What's coming up for me as you're sharing some of this stuff kind of goes back to where we started, which is kind of what are the boxes that we are presented growing up, and how are we learning to check those boxes? And I don't know what your experience was like growing up in Michigan, but for me, there weren't a lot of boxes of how to be emotionally available, how to communicate feelings, how to prioritize listening and being empathetic to someone. So a lot of this stuff for guys is kind of relatively an untrained muscle, right? It's a skill that is just kind of sitting there. And now that you're in a relationship and you have checked that box and you don't want it to go away, like how do you figure that out? And so I think some of the things that we're talking about, men in general don't necessarily have the experience and the training and the societal kind of like support of how to do this well. And that's one of the reasons why I love working with guys, right? Is once we kind of like navigate the coping mechanisms that haven't been working for them, in the first couple of sessions, really digging into kind of who they want to be as an emotional being. And a lot of people come in relationships and really want to learn how to be in these kind of conversations. So one of the things that people talk a lot about with me is intimacy, and how in addiction it kind of robs us of intimacy. Intimacy meaning like a deep relationship with others or ourselves. And so I heard this thing a long time ago that intimacy is into me you see. And so I feel like a lot of what we're talking about is how do we let somebody share their insides, and how do we value that and show them that we value that, as well as how do we begin to show other people what's going inside of us and getting that back and realizing that that is going to increase the connection in that relationship and probably provide for a lot quote unquote better relationship if we're kind of trying to measure how a relationship is going, but it's really challenging.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you're talking about intimacy, right, and how people experience that, I think one version of that is about kind of their feeling like they are, the most important thing. They feel like they're a priority, right, whether it's in that moment or to their partner. And I think that what happens, to your point, when you are dealing with different types of compulsive behaviors, addiction, however you want to define it, that part is they are not the most important thing to that person in the world, because the focus is really going on to whatever that thing is, whether it's substances or whatever it is. And so I don't think that we have an unlimited amount of priority that we can place on different things in the world. And so if your partner feels like they're not that, then they're not going to have those same feelings of intimacy, which is, why you see some of those things kind of melt away, even with, like, for instance, like a job, right? If you're somebody who focuses all on your job, then many times the partner will feel like they're not close to their partner. So I think we just have to kind of understand I think in relationships, to your point of checking boxes and things like that, I think, when you're younger, you have all these things that you're told to do and wanted to do. And then I think as we get into relationships later on, now we just go into evaluation. It's no longer like, what do I need to do about this? It's, am I happy? Do I feel like a priority to my partner? So we start evaluating that. But one of the things I think about in life is that everything that's good in my life has been hard. Not meaning that it's bad, but it takes work. And I think any partnership and relationship falls in that category where to have a good, healthy relationship, it takes a lot of work. But I think, when you have those, it's all worth it.
Yeah. I think that a lot of the struggle in relationship is that we just don't know what the path is forward, right? It's like each time we're in a fight, it's like, well, how do we get in this fight, right? Because we were good a week ago, we were good a day ago. Like, how do we end up here? Like, we've worked through the hard stuff or we've repaired before. Like, how do we end up here? And it's kind of like, well, yeah, that's part of how relationships go. Something flares up and you need to, like, apply the things that you've learned from each other to get through it. Because I think it can be discouraging for couples that do couples therapy or do recovery work and then, find themselves in a disagreement or, an argument. And it's like, well, why are we doing this? Well, these things are kind of ongoing, right? There's no like, okay, now I've achieved a level of relationship where conflict never exists again. It's going to come up. And so it's not like, one of the ways that I think guys can kind of see it is good and bad. And I think when disagreements come up, if we put it in the bad category, then it's going to be really challenging to have a conversation with someone when we're coming in like, this is broken or wrong or bad, rather than like what got us here, right? And how am I feeling and how are you feeling? And as a strategy of how to get out of it and get through it.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it goes back to open communication. And I think one of the things that causes conflict is that you don't have that open communication. So things build up and then something happens and it all comes out. And then the other person is kind of confused by that because they didn't even know that you were this upset about it. And, one of the tips that I give people is with any partnership, again, whether it's romantic or business or whatever the work, type environment, I think that if you can get in the habit of checking in with each other and ideally do it every night, is that you go to your partner and just say, like, did you get what you needed from me today? Was I the partner that you need in your life? And then having the trust that they will tell you if they're, having it be open enough so they're going to tell you if there isn't something, then a lot of times what that does is that relieves the immediate level of how upset the person is. So that's kind of like a release valve so it doesn't build up. So if you can have even 3 to 5 minutes every evening with your partner and just check in with each other and say, hey, is there anything that you're really upset about? Is there anything that I'm doing that's bothering you? Am I taking care of the things I need to? If you can do that, then you likely have a much better understanding of where your relationship stands. And then if it's not in a place that you want to be, then you can make changes to try to have it be. But because I think everybody wants to be in a good relationship. But like I said before, it takes work.
Yeah. Well, and I think kind of that check in, like each couple needs to figure out what it is to really learn about how to be supportive of that other person. Right. And check ins can definitely be one of those things. I know for my relationship, like having space between the check-ins is helpful. Otherwise, it feels like we're kind of always kind of like not allowing like any space between it. But like I would say for us, it's a little bit more on a weekly basis of, like what are you noticing and how does it feel and how can I be more supportive? But I do think kind of that premise of checking in and wanting to know, right? I mean, if you really want to know how you're possibly negatively influencing your partner, that relationship is probably in a pretty good place.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the key is wanting that information, having a pathway of how to share it, and then reacting in a way that allows your partner to continue to come to you with these types of things. And hopefully that happens in both directions.
Yeah.